In 1566, a woman named Agnes Waterhouse confessed that she kept a cat called Satan, fed it drops of her own blood, and sent it to do harm. A century later, a man named John Bysack confessed to nursing 6 snails at his side, rising from his bed each night to feed them by the fire. These creatures had a name. Historians call them familiars, and for more than 100 years, they sat at the center of English witch trials. Welcome back to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
This is Sarah Jack. Today we're joined once more by Dr. Holly Bamford, a witchcraft researcher who recently defended her doctoral thesis on English witchcraft and will be presenting on the Witch's Familiar at the Magic and Witchcraft Conference next week in York. In this conversation, we trace what the familiar actually was, why it mattered so much to the people prosecuting these cases, and what it reveals about motherhood, marriage, and the men and women whose lives were reduced to a single accusation. Welcome back to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast, Dr. Holly Bamford. What have you been up to since we last talked?
Thank you both for having me. It's been a year and a half, 2 years since I talked to you both the last time. I've been busy doing all sorts of research into witchcraft. I finished my thesis, so I defended my thesis in February, so I've had a bit of time to explore the rabbit holes that I couldn't do when I was focusing on my thesis. So it's been nice to go back over my notes and look at stuff that I've circled maybe later and look at those and delve into them. So I've been doing a lot of research into familiars, which is what we're going to talk about broadly today, but also looking a little bit more into child witches more generally, and also expanding into a little bit more European, because my thesis was predominantly on English witchcraft. So looking at the wider context has been really, really fun and just a nice kind of avenue to explore.
We're just excited to talk to you about what you're going to be bringing to the Magic and Witchcraft Conference in York, England for 2026.
Yeah, the theme for this year's Magic and Witchcraft Conference is nature, so it's a natural magic kind of broadly, and because obviously witchcraft is quite supernatural, but there's lots of natural elements within it. So my first kind of thought is, especially because I'd submitted my PhD when the call for papers came out, I was like thinking about all of the witchcraft stuff that I'd looked at. And I remember way back in Boston last year at the RSA, I talked about this man, John Bysack, because I was talking about male witches, and he's the only witch that I'm aware of that has snails as his familiars, which I've always found fascinating. I'm sure we'll get to that in a bit. And I thought, okay, so part of what I was thinking about in my thesis was, oh, look at all these different animals that are familiars. What's that about? Kind of broadly. But I didn't have the scope or the space to really explore it. So I figured this conference would be a really good place for me to explore that and talk about it and present maybe a more experimental paper than a very academically rigorous one, but explore animals. Why are certain animals more commonly familiars? Why are others? Why is this witch got a hedgehog and this witch got a cat? So the kind of speculative, sillier questions that still lead to some sort of interesting ideas about broader witchcraft beliefs in early modern Europe and early modern England, and also look at how significant the familiar was in early modern English witchcraft, because the familiar, a lot of research has been done on the familiar, but I haven't found anything that really, I don't think we will have a definitive answer, but I haven't really found anyone saying that they've got a definitive answer. So I've been enjoying over the past month or so, like a couple of months, exploring animals, and it's a really good excuse to just look at really cute pictures of pets, which is my selfish motivation for this paper.
What are you finding generally is a familiar in the English tradition, and why does it sit so close to the center of witch trials?
So the familiar is, especially in English, the English context, is really interesting. So in continental Europe or in Scottish witchcraft, there's a lot more kind of more specific ways in which the familiar is talked about. Whereas in English tradition, I feel like the familiar is such a multifaceted creature, and I think they really do embody different aspects of English witchcraft belief. So, of course, their kind of main representation, the main kind of point of a familiar is they are representative of the diabolical pact. So it is the familiar is, for perhaps your listeners that aren't the most familiar with these creatures, the witch is said to form a pact with the devil, in which symbolically they give blood to a small creature, which in turn that creature will then commit acts of maleficium on behalf of the witch. Charlotte Rose Miller has written quite a lot about familiars, and she argues that these familiars kind of bridge the gap between the demonic and the sexual aspects of English witchcraft. I agree broadly with that. I think familiars are a lot more an amalgamation of different aspects of witchcraft belief. And in some trials, certain beliefs will be a little bit more present than in other trials. But I think broadly, and I was thinking about this earlier today, I think they represent the three kind of main aspects of English witchcraft belief. The kind of the diabolical aspect of English witchcraft, so the diabolical pact, the involvement of the devil, that sort of thing. But they also represent the threat witchcraft was to society, because by and large, these are the familiar as a character or as a creature are perversions of normal animals. So it's a perversion of the natural world. So it's showing how witchcraft is a threat to broad society, but also the kind of third main aspect that I think familiars represent is the threat of witchcraft to the family and to the household. Because you have the familiar and witch relationship is almost a kind of diabolic or perverse reflection of the parent-child relationship or the husband-wife relationship and other sort of fundamental relationships within English society at the time. So I think familiars are so important to English trials because they represent so many different things, but also on a kind of practical, basic level, if you have a familiar spirit, you have to feed it somehow, so there is physical evidence. That's where the idea of the witch's mark comes into play, and people getting searched for the witch's mark over and over. You see that in English trials, especially in the Hopkins-Stern trials. You do see that in Scotland and continental Europe. It's really prevalent in the Newcastle trials as well, just to name a few. But you have, I think by and large, the familiar is representative of the broad spectrum of witchcraft beliefs in early modern England.
And we know a lot about witchcraft beliefs and the witch trials themselves from pamphlets that were written about the trials.
Yeah.
Who was writing those witch trial pamphlets and who were they writing them for?
So, by and large, I'll find the exact definition. So, a really big part of my thesis was looking at witchcraft pamphlets. So I've read every single English witchcraft pamphlet between 1550 and 1700. There's a lot of them, and they are all really different. You've got some that are 2 pages long. You've got some that are 80 pages long. You've got some that we know the author of, but the vast majority of them are published anonymously. Charlotte Rose Miller, just to go back to her, she describes a pamphlet as something that describes a witchcraft trial or a series of trials and is designed to be read or absorbed by a popular audience as much as one can tell. So that broadly means that these witchcraft pamphlets are designed for a popular audience. They're not just designed or produced for the elite circles or a local audience. They are designed for a broad audience. Most of them are published and dispersed throughout England and throughout the UK as a whole. I think what's interesting about the pamphlets' authorship is that a lot of the time they are anonymous, but you can get some kind of hints to who wrote them. So a lot of them are almost certainly produced by people close to the trial. So these aren't strangers that hear about a trial like down the grapevine and then decide, I'm going to get on this, I'm going to write a pamphlet about it just to like cash in, if you like. Instead, I reckon the majority of them are produced by either clerks of courts or relatives of the accusers. The Witches of Warborough's pamphlet, there's evidence that the main accuser, Robert Throckmorton, and I think Gilbert Pickering's the name, his brother-in-law wrote the pamphlet and edited the pamphlet. You can hear the voices. Marion Gibson has done some wonderful work on witchcraft pamphlets for anybody who wants to read more. But perhaps one of the most famous ones, Thomas Potts' The Discovery of Witchcraft, he is the named author on it. He is a clerk of the court. So you have that kind of precedence of people who are writing witchcraft pamphlets are close to the trial. And I think it's probably important to mention that the 1566 Agnes Waterhouse pamphlet is anonymously published, but it's definitely written by the author, was definitely at the trial, because you can hear the author's voice throughout the pamphlet, and there's information arises that would only have arisen from someone who watched the trial or was present in the room. So you can get glimpses at these authors through reading these pamphlets, but as always with history, we're not 100% sure. And it does vary. I think it's important to emphasise that the over 70 witchcraft pamphlets in this time period are incredibly varied sources. Some of them are more documentary, so they're more, this is what happened. Some of them are a little bit more sensationalist, so some of them are a bit more argumentative. They're going in from the get-go, they're saying this person is a witch. Aren't we good for catching her? Almost. Just to very generalise. So they are a really interesting source base, not without their issues because of how varied they are, but they are really useful for looking at witchcraft beliefs, for looking at how people perceived witchcraft cases and that sort of thing. They're really interesting. I could talk for hours about them.
Does the number of pamphlets, does it indicate how many trials there were? How do we get that number for England?
Not really, because not every trial has a pamphlet. And there's a series of, I want to say 3 pamphlets written about one case over a period of time. You get some pamphlets written about cases in a different country that are then republished in London. So you get a few of them, which are always fascinating to read. But I excluded them from my source space in my thesis just to keep my focus. I think it's hard to give an exact number ever for how many witches existed, how many people were accused of witchcraft, how many were executed, because you can examine all of the archive sources, but there are, for example, there's the 1601 Trebizond case, where the information we have for that is the informations and examinations produced by Thomas Ridgway, who's the magistrate. But we don't have any of the court records, we just have his kind of preparatory work, because the court records for that time period don't exist. They either burnt in a fire or have been lost, because it's 400, 500 years ago. So the home counties, those sources survive a lot, those archive sources survive a lot more than in other counties and the other Assize circuits. So the circuit courts, the main kind of central courts that try witchcraft, are travelling, and some of the records for certain circuits survive better than others. So we can get a better estimate for the home counties than we can get for the Northern Circuit, for example. And likewise, because the Civil War happens in this century, there's a lot of upheaval, so some documents don't survive. I remember going to the Tyne and Wear archives in Newcastle to look at a council record book, because I was looking at the Newcastle witch trials, and the entire book, it's a massive tome, and half of it is burnt. It looks like it's been dipped in fire and pulled out. So we're not going to be able to see a lot of that. No matter how good imaging technologies get, there is information, unfortunately, that is lost, and part of our job as historians is to accept that and make educated guesses without lying, basically. So to answer your question, who knows how many people were accused of witchcraft? But I think it's important to look at the individuals we do know who are accused of witchcraft and try and tell their stories as much as possible. My main point of my thesis was I wanted to tell the stories that these people had, because at the end of the day, yes, they're accused of witchcraft, but they're people and they've got lives beyond the accusation. And witchcraft pamphlets, despite the fact I love them as sources, they will only ever tell us about the witch. They won't tell us about the person.
Turning to one of those stories, you had mentioned the Agnes Waterhouse case. That's a 1566 case with a cat called Satan. What makes that case so foundational?
It's one of the first published pamphlets in England. So it's significant in that way because there isn't a kind of pre-existing precedent of producing these documents. But it's also, because it's one of the earlier pamphlets, it's a lot more descriptive as opposed to argumentative. There is a lot of, you can tell that the author, the writer, is editorializing parts of it, but it is a lot more descriptive in a sense. So you get a lot of information. So it's set out as more kind of transcript style than some of the later pamphlets, which are not so. I think it is really incredibly detailed. You do get, and in this one especially, a real sense that the author was there. You get a real sense that whoever this person was, probably a clerk, he was in the room when when Joan Waterhouse were answering questions. I think it is an essential case for anyone interested in English witchcraft. I think the pamphlet itself, as well as the kind of surviving records surrounding it, is really significant for a number of reasons. Particularly to my work, looking at families, you got Agnes and Joan Waterhouse, who are mother and child. As a case, it covers everything. There's a demonic pact, there's maleficium, there's community dynamics, there's family dynamics, there's refusals to confess, then there is a confession, there's searching for witches' marks. It's got everything in it, basically, that you'd expect to see in a trial. I wouldn't ever describe it as a typical case, because I don't think there is a typical case of witchcraft, but it is really significant in that sense that Agnes Waterhouse, she has a familiar Satan that you mentioned, Joshua, who she feeds, who she got off possibly her sister or sister-in-law, and she confesses to using this cat to commit acts of maleficium, and she confesses to feeding it, which leads her to be searched by the jailer, and they find many spots on her which are considered teats. They're not called teats, but they are within the kind of grand scheme of English witchcraft. We would, as historians, describe them as teats, which is where, by and large, witches fed their familiar from. Think of it as this kind of myth of the third nipple. Kind of stems from the same kind of beliefs. But you also have in this case Joan Waterhouse, Agnes's daughter, seeing her mother allegedly use this cat for maleficium, be frustrated and angry at a neighbour, and then attempt to use the cat as well. So you also get this really common idea of witchcraft being passed down the maternal line in this case. And you also get, within that same kind of idea, you get the idea that witchcraft could be taught or witchcraft was inherited, and the corruption that witchcraft placed not only on the witch themselves, but their family members and those connected to them. So you get, if we call back to the kind of three main aspects I was talking about, familiars, you get how witchcraft is a threat to society as a whole, because it's threatening some of the foundational relationships of early modern society. You have to remember, this is a time where family is so important. Family is talked about, it's preached about. We're in the midst of the Reformation. We're getting towards the end of it, where Protestantism is being actively defined. And a lot of that and a lot of writings are dedicated to describing this kind of concept of the ideal family and what the family should look like, how people should behave. And witchcraft is not the opposite of that, but it threatens that.
How does the presence of that mark that they're looking for, the witch's mark, prove that there's this diabolical pact?
It's a great question, because I think sometimes as modern people we can go, oh, it's a mole. I've got a mole on my face. I know full well that I don't have a familiar. My partner's cat isn't feeding off it. But at this time, the idea that familiars were used as almost like a mechanism of witchcraft is really common. And in a lot of the source materials, it's described as the witch feeding them with a drop of their blood. So you could think, prick your finger, get some blood out. The cat or the dog or the hedgehog or the snail will eat it. But then in some cases, they are specifically referred to as teats, which leads you to have the kind of image of, like I said earlier, a third nipple or something similar to that. And because the familiar witch relationship was symbolic of the diabolical pact, what was symbolic of the witch familiar relationship is this teat. So it becomes a case of, if you've got a strange mark, you're more likely to be a witch. But if someone just walking down the street had, say, if we go for the stereotypical witch with the nose and a wart on it, if you see someone with a wart on their nose, that doesn't make them a witch. The fact that they are all these other things, and then they also have a teat, is almost, it's confirmation as opposed to direct evidence. At least that's how I read it a lot of the time. It's a lot more common in Hopkins and Stern's The East Anglian Witch Hunts, where they specifically mention it, and they specifically hire or recruit, even is probably a better word. They recruit women to search other women who are accused of witchcraft to find their teats. In the Newcastle trials, the Merchants Guild hire a witch hunter from Scotland to come down and examine these witches for marks. And quite a lot of the witches who are accused of witchcraft in Newcastle who are executed, marks are found on them. So it's used less as a kind of initiator, less as a, oh, if you've got a mark, you're a witch, and more of a, if you're a witch, you've got a mark, if that makes sense. It's that distinction of, it's part of the belief system, but it is confirmation. It's not the initial accusation.
Our audience will be pretty familiar with witches' marks and teats because the New England witch trials, particularly Salem and Connecticut, they were often searching for those. Sarah's ancestor, Rebecca Nurse, was searched for a witch's mark.
I think it's interesting that it transcends geographical locations. I think it is one of those that has made its way into popular culture about witches. If you think of a stereotypical witch or a kid's Halloween costume for a witch, quite often it comes with the long nose with a wart on it or something like that. So it has made its way into kind of like popular iconography of the witch, which again is really interesting, and another one of those rabbit holes that I would like to go down at some point when I have time.
You had mentioned earlier the sort of parent-child relationship between witches and familiars. That especially seemed to be true, or believed to be true, about women witches and their familiars. Why was that? Can you explain what that relationship was?
Yeah, so it is definitely especially more true in female witches as opposed to male witches. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that witchcraft was broadly seen as a feminine or a female crime. And it's related a lot to the original sin. The kind of gendered expectations placed on women were a lot more fragile and more easy to be visibly broken. So it's a lot easier to see a woman who's not living up to these expectations as counter to the ideal and therefore be accused of witchcraft, which is not an easy process, but that's a very broad generalization. But I think it's useful to think about. But specifically in relation to the familiar spirit and the witch, the relationship between the two in women is seen almost as like a twisted parody of the mother-child relationship. So it is a diabolical reflection that aimed to highlight how far removed from this kind of good mother figure or this ideal woman figure the witch was, or how the people describing the witches wanted to depict the witch as really far away from being the good mother. So this kind of prevailing idea in historiography that the female witch represented the anti-mother figure. So the good mother looked after and cared for her children, the evil witch didn't. She neglected her children in favour of caring for familiars. So scholars such as Deborah Willis have built on this idea. She proposes that the witch-familiar relationship was the inversion of the mother-child relationship. And I think to muddy the waters in that kind of dichotomy between good mother and evil witch, I would argue that the witch is a good mother to her familiars. So her familiars are diabolical, obviously. They're demonic animals, but they are really cared for. The source material shows that these witches are caring for their familiars. They're going out of their way to feed them, to look after them. And I think this kind of represents a lot of the societal anxieties surrounding motherhood. So in this time period, being a mother was what was expected of women. So from childbirth, you were raised knowing that you were going to be a mother. So you were taught how to be a good mother, what was expected of you, how to look after yourself, etc., etc. Because there's a kind of prevailing belief during this period and earlier that a good mother produces a good child. And that's really significant to English society. So the familiar witch, that relationship is threatening the mother-child relationship because the witch doesn't have the time to care for her actual biological children because she's caring for her familiars. But within that relationship, the witch-familiar relationship, she is being a good mother by looking after them, by caring for them. And you get the case, so just to harken back to Agnes and Joan Waterhouse, she has a familiar and she looks after it, but she also looks after her daughter at the same time. So it's almost like these two ideas coexist within, and it blurs the waters. And from this dichotomy of good mother, bad witch, I think they're actually, as two separate figures, they are separate figures, but they are uncomfortably close. And that is representative of the anxieties surrounding motherhood and femininity in this time period. It's an interesting idea, the witch as the anti-mother. So Diane Perkis describes the witch as a figure who could be read against and within her own social identity as a housewife and mother. And Deborah Willis, as I said, she understands the witch to be a bad mother. And her main argument is about witchcraft accusations were about maternal issues such as childcare and breastfeeding. And just to go off on another tangent, breastfeeding is quite similar in some ways to the feeding of familiars. So the way witches feed familiars, it's a drop of blood. And there was a belief in this time period that breast milk came from the blood of the mother. So it was a conversion from blood to milk, which fed the child. And if you're feeding the familiar, you're stopping that process partway. So I think there is this dichotomy that kind of exists, especially in the pamphlets we talked about, because it's a useful literary device. It's useful to go, we're all good, virtuous Christians. The devil can't touch us, we're safe. These witches are evil. None of us are witches because they're so evil. Whereas in reality, the beliefs are a lot more complicated because people are a lot more complicated. Because no one can live up to all of these expectations all of the time, especially some of them. If you read some of the family advice manuals that describe how a mother's meant to behave, they're quite unrealistic, even if you view them through the lens of the people writing them. And I think if you view the witch, the female witch, especially within the context of her family, you can see that she's not the anti-mother. She is still a mother the majority of the time, and that witch is just one interpretation of her identity. So I don't think being a witch excludes these individuals from also being good mothers and good wives and good daughters, or etc. I think it's a case of a lot of the time when we look at people accused of witchcraft, we see witch. We don't see the rest of their identity. And by seeing the rest of their identity, you can see that the witch label as itself is really complicated. and has all of these different aspects that draw on the different aspects of the individual as well. To answer your question, it's complicated, and it gets more complicated the more you look at it, but I think it's important to look at it as much as you can.
We have accusations in 1692 during the Salem witch trials where specifically an afflicted woman, teen, is stating that the accused witch is breastfeeding pigs. Our listeners, if they're following us on the Salem Witch Trials Daily podcast, we talked about that just last month.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating how, in different contexts, different aspects of witchcraft belief can be interpreted. So the feeding of familiars can be a transactional one in certain contexts, but then it can also be a maternal action in other contexts. And I think that goes back to what I was talking about earlier, about how the familiar is a multifaceted creature and how it's representative of an amalgamation of beliefs. It's easy to talk about, people believed in witchcraft, but actually witchcraft is an incredibly broad, incredibly complex topic that has a lot of different aspects within it, and different places will emphasize different aspects more at different times and different people. And I think that's why it's important to take each case, each witchcraft accusation individually and within the context of the wider witchcraft beliefs. But if you don't take it individually, if you remove it from its cultural context and just go, oh, it's another one of these accusations of witchcraft, then you lose a lot of the nuance and a lot of the kind of humanity of these cases.
If female witches had familiars who were like children, what were the familiars of male witches described as being?
That's a really interesting one. I really like talking about male witches because if you talk to people who don't know anything about witchcraft, but obviously are aware it exists or have heard about the Salem trials at school, but maybe not looked at it later, they always go, oh, it was all women who are accused of witchcraft. And for most places, and most times, that the majority of the accused are women. But I think separating male and female witches can result in diminishing the fact that men were also accused and executed for witchcraft. And I think through the process, I spent a lot of last year and the year before looking at male witchcraft and beliefs about men and masculinities in the early modern England. And a lot of what I found was both the expectations placed on women and the expectations placed on men stem from the same place. It's all one kind of set of gendered expectations. And yes, they are gendered, so they are different. But also I think the pressure is the same. And the failure to live up to those expectations results in the same problem for the individual. In this case, accusations of witchcraft. I think for male witches, or for men even, that don't live up to these expectations, they're not necessarily going to get accused of witchcraft. That's just one route they could take. In other cases, they can be described as being overly aggressive, or I can't remember the exact word that I'm thinking of right now, but there's other punishments, if you like, that's not quite the right word, for men who fail to live up to these expectations. But to talk about familiars of male witches, you get a few different types, if you like. These types, obviously, they're not set in stone. For male witches and their familiars, you get some male witches who have familiars, and it's almost transactional in a way. So it's a lot more transactional than the female witches. There's a man called John Walsh who's accused of witchcraft, and his magic is considered, it's a little bit different to what you and your listeners will be imagining thinking about witchcraft, because his witchcraft is a little bit more learned. I think Marian Gibbons calls it masculine semi-learned brand of magic, something along those lines. And part of this is because Walsh takes great aims to differentiate himself from malefic witchcraft and attempts to construct himself a little bit more like a cunning folk, so a cunning man. So almost like a white witch, if you want to use those terms for him. So his familiar, he describes a ritual he uses to summon his familiar, which is a lot more like European learned magic as opposed to the diabolical pact. So he's clear to go like, this isn't a diabolical pact. I wanted a creature to help me do whatever. And part of this is because his witchcraft is described within a very anti-Catholic framework. So the people accusing him are trying to paint him a little bit more Catholic. Again, this is during the Reformation, towards the end of it, where Protestantism and Catholicism don't like each other, to put it mildly. So I think Walsh's kind of relationship with his familiar is presented as a little bit more transactional because of various reasons. But it's also interesting that he's able to do that because as a man, he's able to defend himself a little bit more as opposed to a lot of these women who couldn't. He is semi-learned. He had an apprenticeship. So he's not an elite, but he's able to defend himself to some extent. I think, interestingly, Walsh is said to have received his familiar from his master, so from the master of his apprenticeship, who was a Catholic priest. I think that's important to mention. So again, within the context of anti-Catholicism, anti-Catholic sentiment, even within the time. And I think that's a bit of a mirror of the familial inheritance of familiars like Agnes and Joan Waterhouse. So I think Walsh is a very masculine interpretation of the witch-familiar relationship. So that's on one hand, you've got this kind of very masculine familiar witch relationship. But then you've got the kind of more typical male witch familiar relationship, which mirrors a bit more the female witch familiar relationship. And the man that I think suggests this the most is John Bysack, who has featured heavily in a lot of papers I've given for whatever reason. It's because of the snails, I'm just going to say it. He's got 6 snail familiars. He's the only man who does, and he's the reason I wrote this paper for next week. Just because my question was, when I read the source all those years ago, I went, why snails? So John Bysack is accused as part of Hutchinson's witch hunt in East Anglia. He allegedly confesses to having 6 familiars in the form of snails, which he feeds from teats on his side, and they are called teats. And as part of his feeding process, if you like, he leaves his bed at night to lie down by the fire and feed them, which Malcolm Gaskell has referred to as being similar to the nursing mother, so the mother breastfeeding her child. But personally, I think is a little bit more similar to looking after sick children, which is something men were expected to do as equally as women during this time period. I think the interesting thing about the Bysack case and the fact that Snails is that Malcolm Gaskell is one of the few historians who has discussed him, and he's referred to diabolical pacts involving male witches stopping short of homosexual acts only because this was not a private fantasy of the accused, which I'm just going to say I disagree with completely. I think the interpretation of Bysack's relationship and his behaviour with his familiars as a sexual relationship is misleading. I don't think it's suggesting a sexual relationship. Instead, I think it's showing the kind of maternal nature of the witch-familiar relationship. And just because it's a maternal relationship and it happens to be a man involved doesn't make it homosexual or doesn't suggest it's sexual in any way. I think if you read Stern's pamphlet, I think the language he used lacks any real sexual connotation. It doesn't suggest any sexual deviancy. And I think it suggests some level of intimacy between Bysack and the devil when he makes his pact, but I don't think this is explicitly sexual in nature. And I think, likewise, his behaviour to his familiars, allowing them to suck his teats, is framed as Bysack caring for them, not as a sexual transaction. So I think male witches are really interesting, just outside of talking about familiars just generally, but having this example of John Bysack with his snails leaving his marital bed to seed them has been interpreted previously as a sexual relationship or whatever. And I think that's because a lot of historians have interpreted male witches as being feminized in a way, which is something that Apsengau in their book on male witches in Europe discuss. And they say that within theological literature, so demonologists talking about witchcraft, the elite circles talking about witchcraft, they find it really difficult to come to terms with the fact that men could be accused of something that is a female crime. So there's this kind of disconnect between the fact that witchcraft is considered within feminine terms, but men could also be witches because everybody and anybody can be tempted by the devil. And there's this kind of conflict within society's beliefs and individual beliefs about witchcraft that is represented within male witches. So it's a fascinating topic to get into. But I think it's led to, when we look at individual cases, going, oh, John Bysack's feminized because he is leaving his marital bed and he's forming a relationship with his familiars. When in reality, I don't think it is sexual. I think it's maternal. But that doesn't make John Bysack less of a man because of this, which some people can conceptualize, or some historians have talked about male witches within the terms and the concept of them being feminized men, as opposed to them being, how I would put it, as men displaying an alternative form of masculinity that was just not compatible with the expected type of masculinity.
Dr. Bamford, in the material that you sent to us, you talked also about a man named John Palmer, and he had a curious familiar I want to talk about because this one took a humanoid shape and was a woman called Jezebel.
Yeah.
And what makes her different, of course, from the animal familiars, and what was his relationship with her?
That is such a great question. So part of my ideas behind this paper was like, why do familiars take certain shapes? And Palmer having a humanoid figure as a familiar isn't rare. It's not common. Most familiars are cats or dogs or some form of kind of expected animal, but female witches describe a familiar-like creature as being a man, but John Palmer's familiar spirit appearing to him as a woman-like figure named Jezebel is really interesting. So obviously, Jezebel being the biblical figure, I think is very suggestive of diabolical temptation, but I think it's more suggestive of the fact that it is the familiar spirit is trying to threaten the conjugal relationship between Palmer and his wife. And that's representative of the anxieties of a society that puts so much pressure on the conjugal relationship in order to produce a family and have kids and the next generation of good and virtuous Christians. You have the devil trying to disrupt that. So this familiar spirit being a woman, I think, really emphasizes that. And it's almost like Palmer's love or involvement with his familiar spirit threatens his involvement with his family, which is not great for people at this time. They don't want that. They want it to be the conjugal relationship and the family to be strong. So Palmer's familiar being a woman I think, suggests a strong link between the witch familiar relationship and other expected adult relationships. So I've talked a lot about how the witch familiar relationship can mirror the child parent relationship. I think this familiar and other familiars like it are examples of this witch familiar relationship mirroring other relationships that are important or significant at this time. So I think John Palmer's familiar is a threatening replacement for his relationship with his wife. So instead of having a kind of what was expected a good and virtuous marriage with his wife, John Palmer is instead having a demonic relationship with Jezebel. So his relationship with this wicked and immoral familiar hints and suggests a sexual relationship with Palmer and his familiar. And again, this draws back to the idea of the familiar as embodying multiple different aspects of witchcraft beliefs. Because witchcraft beliefs, there can be sexual relationships between witches and their familiars, and this is one example of it. And I think it shows the sexual relationship is threatening the expected relationship he's meant to have with his wife, but it's framed a lot in his failures as a man. So this is a kind of a demonic distraction from his expected role in society. It's Palmer failing his masculinity. He's not able to be the man that he's expected to be, but he is still having a sexual relationship with a woman. So he's not being a woman. He's being a bad man, but he's still being a man. And I think that's important to emphasize because a lot of, especially older historiography, have described men like Palmer as being feminized men or not being men because of this.
Is there anything else we need to know about your research or familiars?
If you've got another hour, I think familiars are such an interesting aspect of witchcraft belief, not just English witchcraft belief, continental, colonial witchcraft beliefs, because they, within familiars, you get hints at all of the different aspects of witchcraft beliefs. You get the diabolical pact, you get threats to society, you get threats to the family, you get all of it. So I think that a really important thing to look at, and something that I haven't been able to touch on at all today, but is another thing, like another rabbit hole anybody could go down, is, I think Emma Wilby's talked about this a lot, is the kind of influence of folkloric beliefs and fairy belief on these images of the shapes the familiars take. And you see that especially in Scotland and some of the Welsh trials, these kind of ideas come in. So familiars are, if anyone's interested, are a really good kind of gateway into wider witchcraft beliefs. I think if any of your listeners are really interested in exploring this more, Charlotte Rose Miller's book on witchcraft and familiars is really good. And if you're interested in the kind of folkloric fairy beliefs, Emma Wilby's book is really good at that. For me, I think, like I said, the 1566 Joan and Agnes Waterhouse trial is such an important one. If any of your listeners are interested in English witchcraft, that's a really good start because it covers most of the concepts about English witchcraft that are there. As far as my research goes, I've got a few articles in the works, and I'm going to keep looking into all of the really cool and really interesting parts of English witchcraft beliefs as long as I can. It's fascinating, and like I said earlier, these individuals accused of witchcraft have a story to tell, and it's an honour to tell it, and it's an honour to show who these people were beyond their identity of a witch.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much, Holly. Dr. Bamford brings us research to the 2026 Magic and Witchcraft Conference in York, England, where the theme this year is nature. But her larger argument reaches well beyond it. The people accused of witchcraft were never only witches. Thank you for your research, Holly.
The people accused of witchcraft were mothers and husbands, daughters and neighbors. They were ordinary people who cared for a cat or a child and found that ordinary act turned against them in a courtroom. The accusation reduced them to one frightening word, and recovering the rest of who they were is slow and careful work. It is its own form of justice.
That work does not belong to the past alone. People are still accused today, still harmed, still defined by a label they never chose. And that is the reason End Witch Hunt's nonprofit exists.
The Thing About Witch Hunts is a production of End Witch Hunts, a nonprofit working to end witch hunts worldwide. For listeners who want to go deeper into the history of witch trials, Dr. Bamford recommends reading Charlotte Rose Millar on Witchcraft and Familiars and Emma Wilby on folkloric and fairy belief, with the 1566 Agnes and Joan Waterhouse case as a fine place to begin. Both of these books are available in our bookshop, and purchasing them there supports this podcast. Visit bookshop.org/shop/endwitchhunts.
Learn more and support our work at endwitchhunts.org and aboutwitchhunts.com. We'd love it if you would follow our show, leave a review, and share it with someone you know needs to know about it.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.